Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Trekyards. I am still Captain Foley.
Hi, and Koala Kongs. We have the great koala here today. What do I mean, Stuart?
Well, we got he created his own universe, his own multiverse, actually. But yeah, a specific, alternate reality, alternate timeline, really cool, detailed ships, planets, aliens, everything. We have the awesome David Bissig with us here today to talk about the Bissigverse.
And I'm not crazy. The koala is because that's the creator and ruler of the universe in Lower Decks.
And just so you guys know, in the description, there is a link to what we're looking at, all the write-ups that he has. It's some really good stuff. So if you guys have the opportunity and want to look into it more, please click the link and check it out. All right, so David, tell us a little bit why we're here and what we're looking at on our screens right now. Just give us a brief synopsis of what's going on here and what people can expect when they click that link.
Sure. So this is kind of part one of my book installments that I am working on for my universe. In addition to doing 3D models for my ships, I'm also doing a ludicrous amount of writing and a ludicrous amount of hiring of 2D artists to fill in many pretty pictures, of which we are going to get into detail in a minute here. I have two book items I'm working on. This is the Atlas book, where it really takes the priority is looking at the races, the system maps, the kind of the galaxy. It's like an atlas book, like an exploratory trip around the galaxy in book form. I wanted it to kind of be somewhat reminiscent of something like Charles Darwin's book when he's traveling around the Galapagos, just making sketches, notes, and putting all sorts of things together that he was seeing and to bring back home. The other book I'm working on is more of a historical textbook, I guess is the best way to put it, but it has actually more artwork in it than this one does. The Bissigverse, the center story, which we really haven't even told anybody what the center story is, but it takes place in 2190 in my own universe, and it's kind of designed to be like, if a lot of people think a Star Trek Enterprise is kind of like its own thing, because sometimes people think it doesn't really line up very well with Kirk's stuff. It come in 100 years before that, and with the multiverse of Trek, really there's a whole lot of different arguments you can make. Some of them have more validity than others, but my universe is kind of using the Star Trek Enterprise as a base and then moving forward doing our own thing. That was the first show that I watched through cover to cover when I was a kid, was Star Trek Enterprise. So I know it's a crazy thing whenever I have to tell people this. Like, that was my introduction to Star Trek, was watching Star Trek Enterprise. So I would say it's been about 2 years worth of work off and on, as just kind of like a side project or hobby.
Obviously, we've all been scrolling through this before the recording, and there's a breadth of content here. What's the focus? As in, if there's the thing you're most interested in that you've been covering in this.
If I could pin it down to one thing, if you'll bear with me for the explanation, it's you'll go on the Star Trek wikis or the Memory Alpha, Memory Beta, or the textbooks or whatever, and I have all of them in that white cabinet behind me. Is you'll look for an alien species. Let's say, the Denobulans. We'll just use them as an example. There's like this much information on the Denobulan society, and then there's this much on Dr. Phlox, and then like that much on like one or two of them that popped up in books, and that's it. And you know what they tell you in the TV show, but you have to watch the entire TV show to get the freaking 5 sentences worth of information that actually is written on these. So my goal was to, take these races and actually flesh them out and fill them in and make them relevant, because there's some huge glaring holes in existing Star Trek canon for races that you would think would be like very important, especially like that you'll see in this book. And I wanted to fill that in. We need a lot of territory we got to fill in. Well, it's all done by sectors. So what you'll notice is that I remapped the entire galaxy in a new sector map, because there really isn't standard for Star Trek sectors. It's kind of different everywhere you look. So in what I have designated Sector 1, this is all the aliens that are present in Sector 1. And that is essentially how the volumes are going to work moving forwards. There might be some volumes that have like multiple sectors merged into one, just because to make the content fill. It just so happens that Sector 1 just has a crap ton of stuff and peoples in it that need to be explored. But that's the logic. We're going kind of territorially, sector by sector, and looking at who's in those sectors.
Yeah. So are these all pre-established canon races that or some just created just out of your own imagination?
I haven't yet made up a race completely like out of thin air yet. Everything has been like on Memory Alpha. There's like a one sentence snippet of what this species looks like or whatever, and that was all we know about them. And then I took that and ran with it and did my own thing, if that makes sense.
So you're using obviously beta canon and stuff as well in this.
Absolutely, yeah. We're
Yeah.
taking everything from the
And
novels.
Starfleet battles.
Yep,
And Starfleet
Starfleet
battles, which I really
battles.
appreciate.
You're going to see content in here from the novels, from the textbooks, from the video games, then TV shows and the movies. We're taking everything.
I mean, we've already covered some of your ship stuff, and we do have some more ships in this volume as well, which is really cool.
Mm-hmm. Yes, the illustrations were done by Michelle Ariel. She does all of my persons artworks, and then I have Reed Cowhill. He draws my ships, and I have another Dave friend of mine who has a planet generator who generates the planets.
Cliff Notes version. Tell us a little bit about the Kyfarians and how they play a part in your universe.
And I guess how close to Earth then, and why would we never see them?
Bam. So you just hit two very important things. When we have this up, if you look at the galaxy map or the sector map of sectors 1 through 9, you'll see that Kyfaria is like right underneath Earth, right? And that's pretty much where it is in all the Star Trek maps. So my goal was, okay, there's another sentient alien race that's like a stone throw away from Earth. Why have they never been mentioned? Hardly. They have been mentioned in some of the books. And like, why is it that the Vulcans made contact with Earth first when these guys didn't? Because that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And dealing with those kind of questions is something I spent a whole lot of time trying to figure out how to write into their species like bios section, and trying to make that explanation make as much sense as I possibly could. And with the Kyfarians in particular, the big struggle with them was everybody always thinks of like bug races as kind of like, oh, I know what a bug race is going to be like. It's going to be, hive mind, brood queen, blah, 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 whatever. Like these very stereotypical bug race concepts that we have from our pop culture. And I wanted to try and veer away from as many of those stereotypical ideas as possible when writing them, because these are like a fully unique people with their own story, their own culture. They're not exactly a timid people, but they're very peaceful people. And at the time at which they started developing warp drive and trying to get out into the larger galaxy, that was at the time when the Tellarites, the Andorians, and the Vulcans were bashing each other's brains in. And they were, if you look at the map, they're kind of like right in the middle of that, and they're just kind of like, all right, we need to be careful, we need to play neutral here. And when you read their history, you'll see they almost kind of get sucked into some of those wars, and they have to play some very careful diplomacy to not get sucked into that, because they're not really a war-centric people. And later, as we go down their history, you also see as the Romulan War starts erupting and burning all around them, like, again, it takes them a while to really get into the fight. And what's interesting about the Kyfarians, and especially post Romulan War in their history, is their contribution to the Federation that is established and that they end up eventually joining is not like, okay, well, here's some of our ships, here's some of our soldiers. They're like, well, what are we? We're really good farmers. How can we use our farming and agricultural skills to help the Federation? And after the Romulan War, in my universe, there's a big cut of devastation that the Romulans leave behind during their 2059 retreat back into Romulan space. And they're kind of burning the Earths as they go. And the Kyfarians' major contribution to the war is going in as rebuilders, trying to get soils and agricultural areas fixed and establishing new farming complexes, and basically helping manage a colossal refugee crisis that's left in the wake of the Romulan War. And that is where they contribute to the coalition of planets and later to the Federation.
Yeah, and I noticed the patrol ship you have here, the Agea Jack class. I don't know if I said that right. It's got a top speed of warp 2.5, which is actually less than most of the other ships here. Are they less advanced technologically wise?
They got warp drive a little bit earlier than humanity, but they were much, much slower to develop it. And a major reason for that is, like I kind of alluded to earlier, they wanted to stay at home. They didn't want to branch it because there's so much chaos around them. So, they got to like warp 2, 2.5 kind of quickly, and they're like, well, I mean, we're not leaving our solar system really for any reason. We need to invest our resources into other things because this isn't something that we really need. If you read into some of the specs and stuff, you'll see that also this ship is very more heavily centric in security and defense roles, as in protecting itself and doing like basic security stuff. It's really not a frontline warship, and it's not something that you would see in a fleet action. It's not that these people are demilitarized per se, but it is certainly not the focus of their civilization. They are wildly talented farmers and agricultural people, and playing a little bit on their mention in some of the TOS novels. They're actually like a very good, compassionate people. So they are good at running hospitals and dealing with refugees and things like that.
Next up is the Axanari, or Axanar homeworld, which was uncovered in the fastest stuff with the Axanar incident and whatnot.
So this is a very interesting race for a number of reasons, because there is multiple different versions of this race that exists, and it varies pretty wildly depending on where you look. Starfleet battles, Axanari, are very different than the ones mentioned in some of the novels, which are very different than the ones you see on screen. And that's the one that throws people for a loop a lot. They're like, on screen, yes, they were in Star Trek Enterprise. There was an Axanari captain and a freighter, and I forget the name of the episode, which is, again, totally radically different than everything else that was written before them. I know that is a very steep and rich race in terms of its lore in beta canon and subsequent canon. So I decided I didn't really want to mess with that, because you have some folks who remember them from way back when and the original stories that was written. I didn't want to try take that, tweak it, and override it. So I said, I'm just going to take the Star Trek Enterprise Axanari, which we know absolutely nothing about, and just go forward from there. The story I tried to write with the Axanari is basically people who grew up in a system where there was multiple sentient species that arose in the same system. And it's a very large system. If you look at the system map, there's a lot of habitable or semi-habitable planets in this system. And before any of them discovered warp drive, they obviously bumped into each other, and that situation devolved pretty radically and pretty extremely, and resulted in two big wars that we talk about in their history bio here. And the Axanari were kind of like the only people that survived it. Essentially, one of the other races did survive, but like their population was so depleted, and there's so few of them, it's not really enough to maintain a viable gene pool. So they're kind of on their way into extinction. And it's kind of like a dark mark for the modern Axanari, who want to try to help and undo some of that damage. Not that the other side is innocent. They were both lobbing thermonuclear warheads at each other, essentially, especially as their species matures. They want to try and take responsibility for that. They want to try and make things better. And the other aliens that survive, they don't want the help. They're just like, oh, just let us die. We're, it's pretty much kind of their mentality. Yeah, they're a weird bunch, but it's all in there. And it's a big resource center for the Federation, because there's just a lot of stuff there. So as with all the races, the story that is kind of over and over told, but in very different ways, is all of these races have different ways of maturing into the state of which we see them. So we know what Star Trek's version of humanity's story is, from how we got to everybody is awful to, we're in the Federation and we're the capital world of the Federation. Every member of the Federation goes through something like that, is kind of the moral of the story. There is no perfect race that would just kind of came out of the evolutionary womb like, we're perfect, we're good, we're ready to join the Federation. That's not true. And just like every country on Earth, every peoples here has their own way of reaching that level of, I guess, international space maturity.
They seem more militarized for sure, based on just the stats for this ship. You have the battle destroyer, and the fact it's a battle destroyer, the Bonto Beretta class.
They got united, spread out in their system, found other people, and then they got ununited, and then chaos ensued, and then they reunited after that, saying, okay, that was a bad idea.
But speaking of Earth, we actually see in between those races a space dock or space station with a plethora of ships with a wide variety of styles, from some sort of vaguely Discovery-esque, some Enterprise-esque, some 24th century-esque. It's a hodgepodge of things, but a Good looking simple space station.
The Starbase Halifax scene is a shot from the Earth-Romulan War, so you get a huge breadth of different ships in here. The Discovery comment I find funny because, and I actually talked with my artist that read about that, and yes, you're right. It does look Discovery-esque, but this is his interpretation of his style on it. So all the ships that you see him draw in this particular book here kind of have his stylization on it, which I thought was more interesting than just saying like, hey, give me a one-for-one exact drawing of this. I wanted it to have a little bit more play or feel to it than that. Some of the hardcore Trek ship fans will recognize, obviously, the Annex is easy, but we have ships like the Minutemen from Star Trek Legacy, the Poseidon. We got some Daedalus in there. We have some of my Discovery classes, which is also from Legacy. There's actually a Yorktown. The two you see up front are LC classes, which is kind of like not really a canon ship, but enough people of different varieties have made their own take on that ship. It might as well be almost sort of canon-ish or beta canon-y, I guess.
So is it that you get to design the main ships that you want to, and he designs the other ones?
Yes and no. I mean, in that particular image there, I didn't invent any ships. They were either all from video games or, like I said, the LC class, which is kind of like a community-created ship, or the Annex from the show. A better example of that is if you go up a few pages, you'll see there's should look familiar to you. There's a shot of a Javelus class ship, which is from our second episode in there. So that one's one of my designs, and then the ships that are in the tractor beam are the Orion Raiders from Star Trek Enterprise. So that's from the show, and then the little cargo ship at the top, I said, hey, come up with a cargo ship that looks earthy and vulnerable, and that's what he put together.
I absolutely do want to skip straight to the Battle of Draelax, because I mean that is ship filled, and these aren't canon Romulan ships, these aren't whatevers. I mean, Stuart, tell me what you think. There's 3 visible things I can see here of varying degrees. What do you think?
I'm very impressed with a lot of this. You can see some FASA-inspired design, especially for some of the Romulan ships there, which I really like. And actually, there's a ship there that I do want to talk about at some point.
Yes, there's a funny reference ship.
The Misoni Buni class. We'll talk about that in a minute, but there's some funky looking designs here. I really like the diversity here.
This is the Battle of Draelax, and what's nice is these images, when I can, also connect to the backstories that you see in the races. So if you read both the Draelax and the Tanebian bits, you'll see they're both going to talk about this battle in there and why this was such a big deal. And this is when the Romulans attacked Draelax, and essentially the Tanebians and the United Earth came to their rescue. So the hammerhead-looking style ships you see here, or what you're calling Cardassian-ish, are the Tanebian ships, and the Oberith looking ships belong to the Draelax, and then obviously we have United Earth coming in on the flanks, and we have a number of Romulan ships. The Romulan ships are heavily inspired by FASA, because I basically took the Star Trek Legacy Romulan ships and gave them a Star Trek Enterprise facelift in terms of the design, and the Star Trek Legacy ships are basically one for one lifted out of FASA designs. So, which is why you see that connective tissue there. And this was a huge battle, and it was a big disaster for the Draelaxians, but it really gets into why Draelax and the Tanebians have a very close relationship. They had a good relationship beforehand too, and this kind of helped solidify it, and then ultimately brought them into the war and then into the Federation after that.
A Draelaxian cruiser, the first time you sent me this and I was scrolling through, that one really caught my eye. I love that design. Is that one that you designed, or is that one that was you used before in beta canon or anything?
Well, I designed this one, but I think you'll like this story a lot. My philosophy for Federation ships, especially as we get later down the timeline, you're going to see more of this, is the Federation Starfleet will start out fairly human-centric. And the blunt reason for that is, in terms of its design style, is because everybody else's stuff got destroyed in the war. So this is what they had to work with. As time moves on and later down the timeline, the newer and later Federation ships that get designed are going to incorporate more and more and more non-human centric themes into their ships. And this one particularly is very heavily connected to the Oberith class, which hopefully you see the heavy amount of connected tissue there. And the backstory for me is when the Oberith class is launched, 100 some odd years later, that was a Draelaxian themed, heavily Draelaxian themed vessel that had those designed elements put into it, and this is where it came from. This is from 150 years prior.
I definitely wouldn't have made that connection, but once you spell it out, I was like, okay, because it can't look very close because it's generations and generations and generations, so it has to be very like reminiscent or anything else. Okay, neat.
Yeah.
And back to this main pitch, without Roman things, have you had your artists actually like draw all these distinct ships as like normal 3/4? Or are they all abstractly like in the little bits of, shots that we see, or have they actually been all given a proper 3/4?
Not all proper 3/4 yet, but many of them are going to have those as we move forward, and you're also going to see many more ships of like the 3/4 look in the history textbook. I would argue you're going to have 3 or 4 times as many ship images in that. These people I was very excited to work on because these are a super heavy culture-centric bunch, and their culture is basically inspired by, if you look at the way American pop culture treats gothic vampire stuff, for lack of a better term, imagine a more coherent, less goofy, more serious version of that and plop it on an alien planet. And that is how these people run their society. So there's definitely some very interesting and crazy things going on with these people's culture that I think is very unique. And I'm kind of this is the one I'm most excited to hear people's feedback from on how they like, because I really kind of went all the way onto the wall here with this one on writing them and making their culture interesting. And that is, I won't want to say their major contribution to the Federation, but like they have like a very important rite of passage for the leader of their society, but it's like this massive quadrant wide spectacle, like the Olympics essentially. And it's like one of the largest like tourism/sporting events in like the Alpha Quadrant.
And given that all these other races in here are radically different than bipedal, is there a reason why I went for full-on humanoid looking for this?
Yes, and that is kind of part of where I have to draw the line between staying somewhat within Star Trek's limits and totally doing my own thing, because I need to be in the middle. On one side, you have everybody looks like a human except they have a nose prosthetic or a line drawn on their face. And then on the other side, you have the Carl Sagan line of thinking where there is no way a single other race in the galaxy would even look remotely similar to a human if you were to take this to the most hardcore realism extent on the other side. So I need to be in the middle and unfortunately lean a little bit more towards the human side because that's just kind of how Star Trek operates.
Well, we also know for a fact that the old races, the old race seeded life in our galaxy to everyone based off their DNA. There's a reason why all the main races are the same. So any race that is off that beaten path is one that evolved later that's completely separate from that pathway. So most races of a certain evolution look about the same because there's a reason for that. It was intended. And what's the canon reference to these guys?
They are referenced in Star Trek Enterprise a couple of times, and they formed an important part of the early United Earth trade triangle that Travis Mayweather's parents, they were the cargo haulers on that triangle. So he talks about the Draelaxians a couple of times. The Tanebians obviously look radically different than the traditional bipedal humanoid. My goal with them was to say, okay, obviously the first thing people are going to associate this bunch with is horses, and maybe there's a wee bit of that I can play off of somewhat seriously, somewhat comically. You might look at them from a cartoony standpoint and say, oh, that looks silly, but my intent is to try and help change that perspective and make people take them seriously, even though they don't look like what you would consider a normal sentient being. And add like with all my races, like the one thing I really like about this race that I will mention is they have a cultural tradition of renaming their children after themselves. So like, you know, you have like Charles Tripp Tucker III, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, in this species, you could go up to the 157th or the 134th of whatever your name is, right? And it's like the higher that number is, it's like a bigger badge of honor for them. So like you'll have, you know, there's one character named here, the first name is Zush, and they're the 134th person in their family line to have that name. And that's like a huge deal. So it's not quite like an aristocratic style function. It's just something that's very important to their society, is basically reusing these names and passing them down.
So what I'm saying is their birthday cake's going to be really difficult because you'll put their first name, that many candles, and then they're also their age. So if they're over 100 and the 134th, their candles are filled. The cakes are filled with candles. That's tricky. But they got 4 hands, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Well, that's the thing. I was going to ask about that. Like, so they're standing on all 4. You would assume they'd have another setup here to do things with. So how do they work, like construction, like building things wise?
They can stand on 2 feet. So,
Okay.
and that's why their ships are really large. Yeah, this is how they would look when they're walking, but when he gets to their consoles, they would kind of haunch up onto the console and they would just sit there. So like they can get on their back legs if they need to, but like they can also do a lot of really weird maneuvers to do stuff that you wouldn't really think about, because if you look at the picture, you'll see their legs have thumbs as well. So you could have a Tanebian standing completely upright like this with one of their legs up forward on a console typing something. Like on the side of them if they needed to or wanted to. The other thing that is really important to me about this race is how big of a deal science is to their culture, because the super short story is they were controlled by a very oppressive regime that was basically this really ruthless dictatorship, and it was based upon this really kind of wacky religion that they used to kind of subdue everyone. And there's a story about a scientist who eventually inevitably invents a telescope that is able to look into space and prove to people that, hey, some of the things these people are saying are like lies, because you can get in this telescope and look and like see other planets and all this other stuff, and I can also prove to you that like we're not the center of the universe. And basically the story is, through science, this guy who ends up proliferating all this information, that starts a science revolution that actually brings that government down, and in place rises the government that comes to power and ultimately joins the Federation later.
Yeah, well, the one thing I found really interesting reading through this is that they're the only non-bipedal race to join the Federation, and as such, it gives them a very unique position.
The answer in the short term is the Federation is extremely accepting but practical, and it expects the inverse of that with people joining, and particularly with Starfleet. So Starfleet says, listen, we obviously respect you. We know that you know what you're doing. We want to incorporate your science, your culture. We want you to be part of us. But at the same time, we have 30 races here that look like me and 1 race that looks like you. So practically speaking, I cannot go around and redesign all of our starships to accommodate you. But we can have you on star bases. We can have you on ground posting. And we can even go so far as to have Tanebian vessels in Starfleet, which are just purely Tanebian crewed and designed vessels that are operating under Starfleet's banners, so that you can still participate in it.
How many though joined? Because obviously you say, you know, even in all the other eras, there may be 1 or 2 in Starfleet, and that could be 50, 80, 100 years after joining. So even if they did join, there may only be 4 for the sake of it. So are you thinking to then post TNG where now they're like an actual big member world? Because obviously in the next era there's a couple of members. There isn't a federation so much as a group of planets saying, hey there, we're together. So are you thinking actually in this era, or are you pushing that forward, or are they like instantly gimme Federation membership, we're like one of the first 4?
That's probably a subject to an entirely separate video once we get the map fully colored in with the faction maps, because that's probably going to be the number one thing everybody wants to talk about. Best way I can answer that is my take on the Romulan War is a little bit more like World War II, where as the Allied and Communist forces kind of squished Europe in between, not that the Romulans got squished, but the concept is as these forces advanced, they somewhat absorbed the nations that they were liberating, either for better or for worse. So in the Romulan War, the Romulans are coming down from their section of territory and trying to squeeze on the coalition. And then what ultimately ends up happening is, as the coalition holds and then starts pushing them back, everybody that they're liberating is coming screaming into the arms of the Federation immediately after the war. So the Federation is still created by the 4 original races that we all know about, but the Federation's membership list explodes pretty quickly thereafter because there was a lot of people that just got liberated from the Romulans, and there was also there's a lot more people in the coalition than just those 4 races, and all of them end up very quickly falling under the banner because the Romulan Empire is massive compared to the Coalition of Worlds bundle, and they also know that there's other threats out there like the Klingons and the Kzinti, and the concept is like we all need to band together very quickly or else one of these other powers that's around us is going to come get us. So the Federation in 2190 is probably a lot larger than you think, and another quick reason for that is once you see the full map, you'll really get an appreciation for the concept of the neutral zone and how that presents a massive conundrum in Star Trek lore writing because it's massive. And if the Federation was to attempt to actually enforce said neutral zone, they would have to control all that territory, or else it would just be a treaty in name only.
Which it is.
Whatever they want.
I mean, that it is. We
So,
see in TNG, it is. They cross over every other week.
But in the Bisic verse, they do not. So if the United States was trying to create a neutral zone between, I don't know, China and Russia, massive border, they would have to have a means of actually enforcing said neutral zone and controlling the territory in between, if you get what I mean. So in the Bisic verse, it does have that additional dose of realism where the Federation's bigger, the Starfleet is significantly larger, and some of the reasons for justifying that massive size inflation is like, realistically, if you were to control the entire neutral zone, how many ships would you need to do that, and what infrastructure would you need set up to actually complete that? And that is a task in my universe that I take very seriously in terms of realistically lining up. This would be a Herculean effort to actually secure the neutral zone. And that's also, explained in here too.
So back to the question I asked of, in the original Prime, you'd assume a few people join out of interest, and then they might tell their friends, and then
For Starfleet.
For Starfleet, yeah, for the full. So yeah,
Okay,
so it might be 50, 60 years later, now you've got 10 or 20, maybe 30. It escalates. Whereas for you, it's very much once they're sort of absorbed in, they kind of automatic, green stamp, boom, and then they sort of they're said, right, planet, we want 7,000 people to join tomorrow to bolster our forces. They're kind of recruiting from every planet, sort of almost forced prescription, because you said they want to increase the ranks and get their ships and make a fleet, because you're taking the choice away from, do you want to join the Starfleet side? Well, it doesn't matter, you're joining. If you're going to have all these ships being piloted by, that's going to take hundreds of people, and that's already and within a couple of years is what you're saying. So really, if escalation, it feels like very much we need kind of Starship Troopers. We need people today. You're joining, boom, every race, which would definitely create a sense of unified nature. Because if we just have this big war, and now we've got 24 more planets, well, if we're give or take like 75,000 aliens in, well, we're gonna feel homogenous very quickly. Because boy, we've got to interact with aliens, especially if most of them aren't even human looking, or at least a good chunk. That changes the whole politics. It's interesting.
It does, and the 4 quick responses to that is this. In the beginning, the core races literally were drafting people because it was like, our society is going to get annihilated unless you get in a uniform. And then the next component to that is, after the threat of immediate annihilation passes, the economics of the Bisic verse is somewhat different than maybe what you're expecting. And it's not like a joint Starfleet or else mentality. It's more of they make it look like a very attractive career prospect for someone. They make the recruiters for Starfleet do a very good job.
Well, there is their money. You say career, but a career, because people join Starfleet for the betterment of themselves and their race, but it's not necessarily a career. So is there money in these races? Are they thinking we're going to get something from it? Because if they're leaving their planet, especially if they're the best and brightest, they're leaving their race to go do other stuff, and they might not come back for 15, 20 years.
I guess the in-between point then of that is, in the Bisic verse, again, it's a little bit more realistic take. I understand how economies work in Star Trek with the whole notion of a post-scarcity economy, aka we don't need money because everybody has a replicator in their house. So what do you need money for? You have a replicator in your house. You can make anything that you need. We're not at a post-scarcity economy yet because replicators don't exist yet in 2190. So take that into account first. And then secondly, I don't think it's really realistic to maybe one day humanity on Earth could get to the point where they're like, goodbye money, we don't need you. But the rest of the Federation and all these complex economies interacting with one another, like, what are they doing? Are they just doing like a barter system? Or if everybody has replicators, are they even trading at all? You know what I mean? So those are bigger questions for another video. But the short answer is yes, there is some economic incentives behind this. Then the other two answers for the crewing and population bitlet is it is very heavily encouraged because serving together brings these people together faster, and the respective governments also understand that. So it's not like Earth and some human is sitting there dictating to all these other races saying like, here's why you need to be in Starfleet. It's like, it's a much more mature, grown up discussion than that, where like the other races are smart enough to understand this too. And they're like, we want to get our people, our security forces integrated with your people because we want this union to grow stronger and get bigger and better together. And then the last bitlet is, once you see the more of the map filled in here, you'll also quickly come to see that there's kind of a core world section of the Federation that was the coalition of planets, and then there is a very large section that was basically all the people that were formerly occupied by the Romulans or under threat from one of these other various races that were like scared and came to the Federation for protection. The largest chunk of that is definitely the we were formerly occupied by the Romulans bunch, and those people were signing up in droves, especially at the end of the war, because technically they were refugees really at that point, and they're just like, hey, put a phaser in my hand or put me on a ship and I'll go fight. I know how to do things because I was a Romulan slave labor mechanic on impulse drive, so I know how to work an impulse engine, so put me on a crew and I'll go fight. So you had, to use a Call of Duty quote, you had no shortage of volunteers for those reasons. Yeah. So that's how this massive fleet gets crewed.
All right, well, I think that's enough for today, guys.
A lot to think about.
It is. And guys, click that link down below so you can read all this in detail. If you have any questions for David, put them in the comments section. I'm sure he'll be checking that out. We do have more stuff to talk about with him, obviously. We've obviously done other things. So just type in Trekyards, Bessigverse. You'll pull up all the videos we've done with him.
There's more to come.
Yes.
There's stuff in the pipeline, there's stuff filming now. Right. He's writing more. There's volume 1. I mean, this is never ending, guys. 7th anniversary, 8th anniversary. He'll keep appearing. He'll have more and more ships. We'll never get as much as our ship backgrounds, but it's fine.
But you can read a in detailed breakdown of what we talked about today by clicking that link. And also, if you want to ask him anything, by all means, put it in the comment section. He'll be checking it out and answering you guys as well. So then we know what to talk about in future videos, because other people might have questions too. Yeah. So anyway, thank you for joining us today, David.
Yeah, it was awesome. I had a lot of fun.
There's the like button for this video. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any future content from us or David. And by all means, guys, we hope to see you guys again at some point. So until then, I'm Captain Foley.
I'm Kongs and guest
David Bissig.
From the Bessigverse, the koala. See you next time.
Bye, guys.
Bye, guys.